On a spring day in 1995, a shorter than average, heavy-set man by the name of MacArthur Wheeler walked into a Pittsburgh bank with a gun. He walked up to the teller, confidently asked for the cash, and promptly left. Followed it up with another bank shortly after. Later that night, much to Wheeler's chagrin, the police came knocking. It turns out Wheeler decided to rob the banks earlier that day with no face covering. It didn't take long for the police to view the surveillance tapes from the crime, release that to the news, and identify their assailant. Here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. While being walked out of his home in cuffs, one of the officers heard Wheeler say, "But I wore the juice." He later explained that he covered his face in lemon juice to hide from the cameras. For those that don't know, lemon juice has been used as invisible ink because when it's heated, it can be seen and therefore read. To be sure about his plan, Wheeler claimed to have practiced this by covering his face with lemon juice and taking a selfie with a Polaroid camera. He also stated later that the juice burned his eyes to the point where he could barely see. Now, one might suggest that MacArthur Wheeler had a few screws loose, but there wasn't much behavior, other than the attempted robbery, to justify that. 4 years later, in 1999, using this story as a lead into their research, a couple of Cornell professors by the name of David Dunning and Justin Kruger published a paper titled "Unskilled and Unaware of It," claiming the less you know about something, the more likely you are to think that you know about it.
Why did I start this talk today with such an outlandish story? It's not really that crazy. We come across these sorts of attitudes all the time. In the nonprofit club world, we have shareholders, committees, and a board that govern the club. These volunteers, who may or may not have succeeded in their own endeavors, get voted into positions that have the biggest influence over the club, all the while knowing very little about the club and the club industry overall. Observe this graph of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Okay, Mount Stupid is a little rude, but you see high confidence and low expertise for almost all early on. In a recent survey of private club GMs, 40% put board member understanding of club operations and governance at between 1 and 4 out of 10 prior to volunteering. It's nice to see there are some board members that are well versed on the club before joining, but for those that aren't, it's a long uphill climb. The club manager and potentially other department heads are constantly trying to educate new and existing board members and committee members. The effectiveness of the education can have distinct consequences, positive or negative, on the club and the club manager's future. One obstruction to this is ego. It's very difficult for someone that doesn't know a lot about something to dive into this valley of despair if their ego is high. On another recent survey, 1 out of 3 club GMs stated their board egos sit at 7 out of 10 or higher. High egos correlate with high likelihood of not knowing what you don't know. It's amazing the lengths some will go to protect their ego. One of the famous Stoics, Epictetus, said, "It's impossible to learn that which one thinks one already knows." And in Ryan Holiday's more recent book, Ego is the Enemy, he argues ego not only gives you a sense of entitlement and unrealistic expectations, but it keeps you out of touch with reality. It's also important to note that while first-timers and naive people overestimate their abilities and knowledge, the experts know what they don't know. This stages a scene for those that don't know what they don't know to slight these experts and lack confidence in their position. The quicker that this graph can be condensed and you can get to that plateau of sustainability, the stronger the volunteer culture, the happier the team, and ultimately the more productive the overall leadership group will be. Today, the Dunning-Kruger effect sits high on a list of more than 175 cognitive biases. And these biases are universal. They affect our lives personally and also professionally. Today I want to go through 2 more common biases beyond Dunning-Kruger that affect us more than you'd think, and also give you reason to question the conclusions that we all jump to. Cognitive bias number 2, confirmation bias. Let me pose you a question. When's the last time you changed your mind? I'm not talking about what you had for dinner last night, but when was the last time you had a strong belief about something and found some new information that didn't support what you believe? It's difficult, and as a leader, changing your mind can lead others to perceive you as weak or indecisive. I just highlighted how disruptive egos and pride can be, and I think it's pretty easy to spot large ones in others, but what about ourselves? Have you ever caught your pride getting in the way? I think we all know that we're highly emotional beings and we all enjoy coming across those that agree with the passionate opinions that we create. Usually, if an opinion is offered up in our company that we don't agree with, we're quick to sneer and discard it, or better yet, object and then lay some judgment. I'm a pretty big sports fan and have witnessed too many debates on who's better, especially lately, LeBron James or Michael Jordan, Gretzky or Bobby Orr. If you dig a little deeper, you start to notice some patterns and some reasoning for these people's choices. In this particular case, the generation of the opinionator will likely tell you where one stands on the subject. If you grew up in the early 70s watching Bobby Orr, or fell in love with hockey at this young, very impressionable age, no one's going to surpass him. What you're not likely to see is the Bobby Orr fan question themselves and research potential reasons as to why Gretzky may actually be better. It's important to note these conversations and opinions are highly subjective, and even if criteria for best ever was determined, there's no real right answer. There's no matrix that's going to tell you exactly what's right or what's wrong. Here's a short but tricky test from the University of Michigan and a professor named Richard Nisbet on your confirmation bias. Below are 4 cards. They are randomly chosen from a deck of cards in which every card has a letter on one side and a number on the other. Your task is to say which of the cards you need to turn over in order to find out whether the following rule is true or false. And that rule is, if a card has an A on one side, then it has a 4 on the other. Turn over only those cards you need to check the rule. I'm going to give you a minute, and in honor of the late, great Alex Trebek, I will hum the Jeopardy song. A lot of people who haven't been trained answer E, but the correct answer is C, boxes 3 and 4. The only thing you can hope to do in this situation is disprove the rule, and the only way to do that is to turn over the cards displaying the letter A and the number 7. The rule is disproved if a number other than 4 is on the other side of A, or if the rule is disproved if an A is on the other side of the 7. If you were to flip box 1 and it wasn't A, you do not learn anything. And if there is an A, you still can't disprove it until you see if there's an A on the other side of the 7. When flipping the 7 isn't an A, there just isn't enough info to disprove it. Point being, this is obviously a tricky question. Probably will take you longer than listening to one round of the Jeopardy theme song. It takes time, and your brain has to work to get on the right track of thinking. It's a great example of there's more than what you initially see or think to the puzzle. One of the most difficult things as a club manager is establishing a vision for something such as a grand capital project or an extravagant event and not having it supported. What makes the rejection even more disheartening is when the reason seems irrational. You know, you think a new pool is a great idea at XYZ Club because it's going to bring in families and increase revenue. And you head down this rabbit hole of listing reason after reason why it'd be great. Just to have a committee or board shut it down because of timing and maybe an inflated sense of member discontent. Or perhaps you need to cut that classic maple tree behind number 8 green down because it's stealing all the sun and the water from the green. But there's too much emotional attachment to it, and your detailed and highly rational proposal is denied. There's an old adage, it's not your club. And as a club manager, you shouldn't be emotionally invested in it. But one of the toughest things to do is ignore your confirmation bias. You owe it to yourself to take the opinion you formed and question it from both sides. Try saying to yourself, well, I know this is what I think about this topic, and here's why I think. There's evidence to agree with me, but let me just investigate why or how I may be wrong. We should question the opinions and thoughts that we often have. Where'd they come from? Why are they right? Most of the time, the objection in an argument is not very objective. We have no idea how subjective we really are. Imagine if the first one we questioned when an opinion was presented was ourselves. You're certainly able to rebut or converse in a more objective manner. Moving on to our third cognitive bias, number 3, representative heuristic, which is actually more of a cognitive shortcut that can lead to biased behavior, but an important factor nonetheless. To best showcase this representativeness, let's take a look at this scenario. Stan and his group of 16 guys play golf every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday morning at the club. They've played at the same time for the last 10 years. After their round, they order a Coors Light each. About a third of them will have two, and then maybe half will order a sandwich. With the new year and an increased demand on the tee sheet, management has asked them to move an hour later than usual, in which Stan's group is not very happy. He states that between dues and patronizing the club, after the round they bring in a lot of money, and then they threaten to go elsewhere. I think we've all been here. Unfortunately, with about 500 members and maybe $4.2 million in annual revenue to the club, Stan's a little off base and extremely biased with the representation of his group. This is your run-of-the-mill example, and there's many examples that happen at the club daily that require more explanation, especially when members aren't up for hearing them. Here's another example with a bit of a different scope from behavioral economics. Bob is an opera fan who enjoys touring art museums when on holiday. Growing up, he enjoyed playing chess with family members and friends. Which situation is more likely? A. Bob plays trumpet for a major symphony orchestra, or B. Bob is a farmer. Surely Bob's in the orchestra, right? Bob's description matches the stereotype we may hold about a classical musician rather than a farmer. But in reality, the likelihood of B being true is far greater, because farmers make up a larger proportion of the population. All too often we think that others have the same mindset, and that what we see is all there is. It's very easy and natural to gravitate to those that we have things in common with. This is hazardous to progress and isn't likely to serve the majority. C-suite executives are being encouraged to look at diversity and inclusion as a larger ingredient to their decisions. There are benefits and pitfalls to this. Where diversity and inclusion fail us is when it's done with our eyes. Oh, we need some ethnicity because we're all Caucasian, and we need a woman because we're all men. Unfortunately, knee-jerk reactions in order to conform and satisfy public relations can result in a team or group that appears diverse but may not be. It takes courage to question your instincts. You see quotes all the time that say, "Don't doubt yourself," or "Trust your gut." Did you know, according to the Economic Times, 58% of the CEOs for Fortune 500 companies are taller than 6 feet? Well, it turns out only 14.5% of adult men are over 6 feet. It's an interesting stat and very clear evidence of bias at play. I'd like to think there will come a day where height isn't going to be part of hiring criteria. Our teams, whether it be board, management, or department, are best when 1, they are made up of a wide range of expertise, experience, and groups within the club. And then number 2, when the boardroom isn't dominated by a couple of individuals and everyone feels safe enough to contribute. I moderated a panel discussion with 4 industry-leading consultants about a year back. It revealed that the best fit was one of, if not the number 1 factor they're looking for. Best fit, what does that mean? It kind of sounds like a vague or broad notion, but in its entirety, it represents a large piece to a jigsaw puzzle of diverse and experienced professionals. If we assumed we were subjective, assumed we were biased, assumed there's more to the story, and give people benefit of the doubt, we'll be able to make progress at all new speeds. Perhaps the best way to prove to yourself and others you have an open mind is to resort to questions before opinions or answers. It's amazing the progress that can come out of questions. Questions are usually a foundation for great brainstorming. They can provide breakthroughs and elicit deep, meaningful conversations by creating a comfortable environment. You can accomplish a great deal by asking poignant questions. Questions seem to have a close relationship to listening, while answers, they're more akin to speaking. A great way to improve your listening skills is by asking questions, specifically questions you do not already know the answers to. I'm going to run through a few reasons why questions are more progressive than answers. Number 1, buy-in. Chances are you've been introduced to Ken Blanchard and Paul Hersey's situational leadership model. Well, the 4 stages in order are directing, coaching, supporting, and delegating. Being adaptable and being situational are very similar. Personally, I love this model. Situational leadership is one of the most effective ways to work with people. Directing, the first stage in the process, which starts the process, is highly related to answers. When processes and simple tasks need to be understood, answers in clear direction provide clarity. However, as you get into the second quadrant, coaching, questions should start to take over. People need to know they can accomplish things on their own. Great questions by a leader can often generate moments of self-discovery and confidence when answered by those following. And that's when the Blanchard-Hersey model is at its best. Reason number 2 why questions are better than answers: variety. There are so many ways to ask questions in kinds of questioning. If you Google kinds of questions, you can find too many to cite. If you Google kinds of answers, you're still likely to find information on questions. Perhaps the most frequently used questions are simple, close-ended questions begetting a yes or no answer. These seem to be the closest match to answers. They're pretty direct in nature. From there, we proceed to open-ended questions. There may be no end or boundary to open-ended questions. They're pretty powerful. Open-ended questions are more of an art than a science. They can break molds and shatter preconceived notions in one fell swoop. They can come across as relinquishing control, but indeed do the exact opposite. When asked with just the right tone and timed correctly, perhaps even by accident, truly great ideas can be stumbled upon. Rhetorical questions, those ones you know the answers to before you ask, are very condescending and will come across more insulting than almost any answer will be. Sometimes rhetorical questions aren't offered in an ill manner, but are asked because the questioner just wants to give their opinion and they don't really want to truly listen to another's thoughts. They are to be avoided at all costs, personally and professionally. The last reason for today why asking questions is better than giving answers: balance. There is a too much and a too little to everything. Yes, everything. Too many questions by someone you're close to or work with is going to frustrate anybody. But stacking too many questions versus excessive answers, I'll take the former every single time. I think we've all been in the company of a know-it-all or a one-upper, and we know how infuriating it is. Conversely, too few questions or answers can be dangerous. If I'm weighing the balance in question, I would picture a slightly tilted teeter-totter with questioning on the heavier side. Ironically, and historically, answers seem to dominate the management hierarchy. Answers exude this confidence. I'm the leader and I need to prove answers to gain respect and establish dominance. Well, I'm hopeful we're in the midst of a bit of a philosophical change, a combined approach, leadership and management, and yes, questions and answers. Direct answers are absolutely necessary. They're swiftly given, provide direction, and lead to affirmative action. Unfortunately, they are not always welcomed by the listener, and all too often they're derived from assumptions. You can get to a wide variety of answers with questions. Answers, on the other hand, don't seem to trigger many valuable future questions. They end conversations, and usually any potential for anything profound. After an answer is given to halt a conversation, the only thing that will revive it will be a strong question. It's amazing how empowering it is when you give up the feeling of having to be right. With all that this year has presented, I hope that we can appreciate the importance and the priority questions can play over answers. So much progress can be had when intentionally including questions into a process. Asking in order to learn instead of telling to be right is certainly a virtue we can all strive for. Here's a great quote from a professor at Yale. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend the first 55 minutes defining the problem and then the last 5 solving it. I want to touch on one last point before I wrap up. The third learning outcome in my presentation is that the answer is almost always, it depends. There's a running joke with consultants out there that it depends is the answer to every question. In doing some research and prep for today, I came across a Harvard Business Review article from 2014 labeling this as Mazzio's Law. The answer to every strategic question is it depends, with a corollary of the trick is knowing what it depends on. Point being is that there is no standard response or template for solving problems in business. There is always more to the story. Not necessarily something surprising when you hear it, but there is always more when you scratch the surface. Assuming this, there is one tactic that can help you get to the root or the cause. The 5 whys. The 5 whys came out of Toyota from its founder and is still used in their operations today. The premise is pretty simple. If you have an issue, you should be able to get to the root of it with 5 or less why questions. Here's an example. We conducted our first member service survey and it was worse than we thought. Why? Because we haven't done one before to compare it to and we haven't been getting enough feedback. Well, why haven't we been getting enough feedback? Because we don't have the resources in place to get the silent majority, and we're not using the few opportunities we have, such as our frontline employees. Well, why aren't we using them? Because we don't train them enough and engage them as much as we should. Okay, now that was only 3 why questions, and I'm sure it can get a bit tedious, but simply asking why should make any group feel welcome to speak up. As we've already learned, asking questions changes the feel of a discussion and makes people feel more comfortable. Since I started Club Study in June, my mission has been to increase club operators' curiosity. Curiosity means questioning the status quo, trying new things, falling, not really failing, and getting back up to try it again from a different angle. Yes, I work with GMs and managers to pool data, but I'd like to think at the highest sense we're creating some new habits amongst ourselves. Gathering the data isn't really the tough part. It comes in abundance now, but we have to be able to conceptualize it. And this is something that should be left up to those like you that are eyeball deep into the matter. Managers and boards are always looking for a direct route and these apples to apples comparisons. I've heard this saying so many times lately that I've decided to actually look up how many kinds of apples there are. Turns out there are more than 7,500 types of apples. Who would have thought that? Empirical data helps provide a sense of control, but this leaves very little room for any anecdotal conversation, which really is the basis or starting point for any groundbreaking theory. The data and the research is what comes after the initial questions are asked. To wrap up, I want to leave you with one more example of how our thoughts, emotions, and initial perceptions shouldn't be assumed as truth. Here we go. A baseball bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. What is the cost of the ball? I'll give you a hint. It isn't 10 cents. Thanks for joining me today and participating in this conference overall. A big thank you to Roger and to Jim. It was a pleasure to submit this on behalf of Club Study and be included in a group of such impressive people. All the best for 2021.